All right, I think that was about a minute. So I know a few people are probably still trickling in, but we might as well get started here today. Welcome everyone to the December 17th, 2020 presentation of Casco Bay Coastal Academy's Coastal Stabilization Case Studies for Sites in Casco Bay. I'm Damon Yakovleff with the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm an environmental planner with the district, been there for about 6 years now. And for some of you may have been to previous presentations of Casco Bay Coastal Academy. For some of you, this may be the first presentation. I did want to note that this presentation is being recorded due to the large snowstorm we're having today. I know some people probably had their schedules disrupted or perhaps can't join for another reason. So we're providing the ability for people to catch the presentation later on their own time. So we'll make that available, send that out with other resources after the meeting. So the purpose of Casco Bay Coastal Academy is to provide quarterly workshops, educational resources to build the knowledge base of, with the targeted primary audience of municipal board members, conservation commissions, municipal staff, to support project planning, implementation. It also meets a requirement in the Clean Water Act permit for so-called MS4 communities to provide information to municipal board members as well. So our purpose today is to provide information on 2 coastal stabilization case studies with additional information on financial resources. So to provide on how to pay for projects, and the 2 studies today sort of showcase a holistic approach looking at natural systems, where the first case study we'll present really showcases coastal slope stabilization. And then the second case study looks at managing upland runoff to reduce effects on coastal sites downslope from developed areas. Some of the goals for coastal stabilization using green infrastructure are to sort of get away from some of the traditional approaches for stabilizing coastal sites that use hardened approach with riprap, which are large stones or bulkheads, and instead using sort of a mimicry of natural materials and designs that allow for achieving goals like greater wildlife habitat connectivity, a more resilient approach that also uses locally accessible, lower cost materials, can potentially be implemented using local volunteers, so it's lower costs and more compatible with the natural environment in a nutshell. And we'll hear more about that in a few minutes. But first I want to introduce the team who's been working on this. So we have at the Soil and Water Conservation District, Christopher Baldwin, who's the district engineer, Victoria Boundy, the community engagement coordinator with Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, Martha Sheils, the director of the New England Environmental Finance Center, Harold Spetla, planner with Greater Portland Council of Governments, Peter Slovinsky, a marine geologist with Maine Geological Survey, and Charlotte Kahn, who's with Bustins Island Village Corporation. And now, since we've introduced ourselves, we'd like to learn who's on the call today. So Harold, if you could put up the poll, please. You'll see a poll pop up. The first question will ask who you are.
I'm sorry. There's another person from Greater Portland Council of Governments currently logged in. Would that person be able to log out of their account right now?
Yeah, sorry, Harold, that was me. Let me get out of here.
Sorry, made the poll inactive for the moment.
That's too bad. Well, hopefully Rick will be able to come back in. Well, maybe we can blame the snowstorm for it. I've already had to shovel once today. Probably have to go out again after this.
Sorry, Damon. I'm not able to pull it up right now.
All right, well that's fine. We'll how about we come back to it later when you're when you get it working, if you're able to get it working. All right, great. Well, with that, maybe just a show of hands. I can see some of you. Who's here from a municipal board or committee? I see quite a lot. Okay. Who here is a municipal staff person or regional staff person? All right. Got anyone from the federal government? Oh, we got a few. All right, great. All right, so we have I think what that tells us is that we have a mixture of people here from various types of organizations. Thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Peter Slovinsky with Maine Geological Survey.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon during today's snowstorm. Hopefully everybody's safe and dry and warm. I've got the wood stove going just behind me here, so it's cranking some heat. I'm going to try sharing my screen now, and we'll see if that works. These are always fun. These virtual things are always fun. So hopefully everyone can kind of see my screen. All right, I get a thumbs up. So again, I'm Pete Slovinsky with the Maine Geological Survey. I'm going to be sharing with you some information on a project that we have undertaken with the other four New England, well, all 5 New England states throughout the Northeast. And one of the goals of our project was we wanted to design, permit, install, and monitor low-cost, transferable living shoreline approaches that reuse natural materials in Casco Bay. And 2 materials that we have quite a bit of, or at least are getting a lot of, is used oyster shell and also trees. There are a lot of trees on the islands and along the mainland in Casco Bay on unstable bluffs that are falling over all over the place. So there's no lack of trees as well. So we wanted to use those in a demonstration treatment and then monitor those for a period of time. So I'm going to give you a summary as to what sites we selected, what designs we kind of decided to come up with in terms of the locations, and then share with you a status update as to what's going on. So to start things out, we went through a whole process of picking a bunch of sites. We wanted to look for sites that had either a eroding bluff or an eroding marsh toe, 2 things that are representative of the issues that we see in Casco Bay that property owners and municipalities are concerned about. We wanted to have the sites that we selected be representative of a larger geography or the larger region. They had to be owned by a project partner. We didn't want to go and try to get MOAs or MOUs with a variety of different property owners as part of this project. We had to have relative easy or representative site access. And what I mean by representative is there are a lot of islands in Casco Bay. So just to get a sense of how to do one of these projects on an island, we picked an island site. The other 2 sites are on the mainland. We wanted a relatively straight or consistent shoreline type of 150 feet or more so we could have natural controls on both sides. We wanted to have an appropriate MGS living shoreline suitability score, and I'll get into that in a second, and then of course educational and public opportunities associated with the sites. So we narrowed our entire list down to 3 sites. 2 were located in the town of Brunswick in the upper end of Casco Bay and Maquoit Bay. Wharton Point and Maquoit Bay conservation lands. Wharton Point is owned by Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and the town of Brunswick. And Maquoit Bay conservation lands is owned by Brunswick Topsom Land Trust and the town of Brunswick. And our island site that we selected is owned by Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is Lane's Island, which is just off the mouth of the Royal River, across from Cousins Island. It's an uninhabited island. So I mentioned our MGS Living Shoreline Suitability tool. This is a tool that we've developed for Casco Bay only at this point, which looks at a variety of different factors that influence the suitability of whether a site is suitable or not for a potential living shoreline project. And we basically scored all of these, every 150 feet, there's a point. You can see these points all along the coastline here. And those points are a summation of a variety of different characteristics that we assign weighted scores to. So our highest score is highly suitable with a range of 36 to 44. So Wharton Point came in at moderately to highly suitable with scores of 35 to 37 along the project site out of 44. This is what the site actually looks like. It's a small 50-foot segment of a larger eroding coastal wetland. There is a log that's washed into the marsh. I'll explain to you why we chose to have this where the log is. So we're only looking at about a 50-foot treatment on a relatively large marsh edge. Our second site, Maquoit Bay Conservation Lands in Brunswick, scored highly suitable with a score of 37 to 41 out of 44. So it's in that higher range even than Wharton Point. It is on the end of about a 20-minute hike or a quick airboat ride from Wharton Point. And this is what that site looks like. Again, we had an eroding marsh edge. You can see these slump blocks that have slumped down, which is representative of a lot of fringe marshes in Casco Bay, and a 50-foot section along a much larger stretch of eroding salt marsh. Our third site was Lane's Island, and this one's very, very different. It's an eroding coastal bluff. It scored on the low end of moderately suitable, so 30 to 31 out of 44. And as you can tell on this scoring system here, it's just next to an area that we would consider to be possibly or not very suitable, where the yellow is. So these are kind of a stoplight approaches: red, yellow, green. But this is a test site we wanted to test for a coastal bluff. It's owned by a project partner. And it's on the low end of that moderately suitable scale. This is kind of what it looks like. There's a long stretch of eroding coastal bluff, about 10 to 12 feet in height, and lots of down trees. So we had trees on site that we wanted to use. So we're kind of going to get into some of the challenges, solutions, and initial lessons learned at the end. One of the first challenges that we encountered as we started this project was the regulatory agencies from the state to the federal level were very concerned about the traditional use of degradable plastics in the environment. So we talked about using oyster shell. One of the traditional ways of doing that is to take very, very, very light plastic clam netting. You can see how thin the netting is here. Fill it with oyster shell and put it out to create a little kind of sill or a little breakwater at the edge of a marsh to kind of help break up waves or slow down erosion. This is something that immediately raised concerns with the regulatory community because these plastics break down very, very quickly. These bags tear very quickly, and then these plastics become smaller pieces of plastics in our marine environment. So that's something we had to address right away. We couldn't just go out and throw these bags out there. One of the other challenges that we have in Maine, and more so than the rest of New England, is the accounting for the impacts of ice. These are our two Brunswick sites this is in February of last year. And you can see there's big rafts of ice which gouge away at the marsh and drive up over the edge of the marsh. We don't have icing so much as an issue at the Lane's Island site just because of the tidal currents and area adjacent to the Royal River Channel. So what was our solution? Well, we went out and looked for biodegradable products which we thought would be heavy enough to be able to withstand our icing and also withstand some waves. And we couldn't find anything out there at all. A lot of living shorelines constructed in the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states use just typical coir fiber, coconut fiber logs that they put out that fall apart within a month. But they have such high colonization rates of oysters and things that it's okay if those shells fall out. The oysters will still colonize to create kind of a reef. We don't know if that's going to happen in Maine, so we wanted something that's going to last longer. So we worked with BMT Fibers and EJP to develop a custom bag that we had made for us by BMT Fibers, which is made with this very, very, very heavy coconut fiber weave that's reinforced. And then it's 12 inches by 24 inches, weighs about 25 pounds. So it's pretty easy for somebody to move, whether you're a homeowner, whether you're a volunteer, by hand. The other thing we wanted to test is we still wanted to test some kind of plastic product. So what we did is we went out and we worked with a supplier, Tensar. They have this new product out there that's made of highly UV and abrasion-resistant plastic, which is this what they're calling a georeef. It assembles by hand. You can see one folded up in the wheelbarrow, but you unfold it, kind of run these little bars through it, and then you fill it with whatever you want to fill it with, rock, in this case, oyster shell. So it's very, very easy to use, very easy to mobilize, easy to assemble, and then you just fill it with wheelbarrows. So we wanted to test this also. So one of our challenges was COVID, of course, hit. And we had to come up with a way to socially distance, but also fill close to 400 bags with oyster shell. So we came up with a bagging system at Brunswick Public Works with a bunch of volunteers, where we built these bagging stations. A little tiny tractor was used to put oyster shell into these. You could sort out, dirt and stuff off the top of this, fill each tube, and then there's a bag underneath. And then we set up sewing stations, and everybody had their own station, and we sewed these bags by hand. It took a lot of time, but we did 400 bags in about 3.5 days. So again, our goals are to look at these synthetic and biodegradable mixes on small treatments. So this is our design that our engineer at GEI came up with for Wharton Point. On the left-hand side is where that log is located. This would be where the textile bags that are filled with oyster shell would be placed and staked. And to the right of that is where the georeefs would be placed and filled with oyster shell. For the Maquoit Bay Conservation Land Site, we didn't have any logs there, but we had trees that we brought into the site. And what we wanted to do, again, was test a synthetic, this is on your left-hand side, the georeefs, versus a biodegradable product, but we integrated what we call tree runners. These are 10 to 12 foot logs that we put perpendicular to the shoreline that are meant to break up ice as those ice rafts come in towards the installation. So this is what it looked like when we were integrating the trees into Wharton Point and Maquoit Bay conservation lands. On the left is Wharton Point, and the right is MBCL. At MBCL, we had to float these logs in at high tide, lash them at the top, and then let them fall, and then lash them in at the bottom. And all this was done with volunteers at both sites. One of the challenges we encountered was, this was an interesting one, was what I'll call a, quote, dirty oyster shell. This oyster shell, we actually didn't have enough in Maine at the time. We don't have a recycling program in Maine. We do now. But we needed a lot of oyster shell, about 40 cubic yards. So we worked with the University of New Hampshire to get oyster shell from their one of their facilities where they have aged oyster shell. They have a recycling program where restaurants literally donate their shell, and then that shell is aged for a period of time, in this case, about 3 years, on an organic farm. So this is what that shell looked like. What was interesting was this shell was brought to Wharton Point. It was actually aged at the town of Brunswick for another year. And then we brought it to Wharton Point and dumped it. The shell fishermen started just digging around in there, and they saw organics, they saw plastic forks. So immediately this created kind of like this red flag of, you're going to be putting that into our Maquoit Bay. So we had to come up with a solution on the fly to deal with that problem. And this is something that other folks who might be looking to use shell might have to encounter and have to come up with a solution for. So working with Brunswick and IFNW, we developed this screening system on site where you dump the shell through the screen, get out all the bad stuff underneath, pick out all the plastic, it goes into these baskets. The fire department came, filled up a big tub, and then we dipped each one to rinse it off. Okay, so that's how we created clean shell on site. Another challenge was doing all this work with volunteers while trying to work around tides. So we had to bring in logs at high tide. So we have a volunteer gentleman from Smith Boatyard actually donated his barge, brought the logs over by barge at high tide. We put them in place at high tide. And then we worked with the town of Brunswick's airboat to be able to shuttle materials back and forth to the MBCL site throughout all the tides. So we could actually work during low tide. Otherwise, we'd have to be hiking 20 minutes on a trail with all this stuff. It just wouldn't have made sense. So this is what the installations kind of look like. We assembled the georeef, filled it with shell, and staked it in place. It creates this beautiful rectangular reef-like material. It's highly, highly resistant. It actually will tear up your hands if you're not wearing gloves. And this is the placement of the biodegradable bags at the Wharton Point site, and they're staked in place and covered with some coir fabric. At Maquoit Bay Conservation Lands, again, we floated the logs in at high tide and lashed them at the top. Then we put the georeefs underneath. They do not want to be in a trapezoidal shape or a triangular shape. They want to be in that rectangular shape. That was very hard to do. We filled it with shell and then put the bags in place as well. This is what the finishing products look like from the air for Wharton Point. This is from Rick Harbison at GP Cog. You've got your biodegradable installation, your synthetic installation, and then synthetic, biodegradable. We actually tucked bags up in here because because we couldn't get the georeefs to extend to their full height. We had to make up for that by putting bags up on top. So our last site was this Lanes Island site in Yarmouth. Again, it's a 10 to 12 foot eroding bluff, very, very dynamic. There's basically living shorelines there. There's a beach, there's a coastal wetland out front, and these seem to be there all the time. So this bluff is shedding sediment onto the beach to maintain this beach and this coastal wetland. We wanted to see if we could slow down that erosion, but still allow for sediment to go out to the intertidal zone. Working on an island is not an inexpensive proposition, and you can't necessarily do it with volunteers. We had to hire contractors to do this work. The installation here was very different. We call this a stepped crib approach. So basically, fallen trees were beneficially reused to create 1, 2, 3 steps, excuse me, and then root balls, which are kind of cut, the ends of the cut trees were put in that first step along with on the sides to help mitigate for end effect erosion. And then all the material from regrading the bluff was placed in these steps and in front. This is kind of what this looks like from a plan view. You can see each step created is then planted with native vegetation, less salt tolerant as you go up the slope. And then excess material is placed at the toe to create sacrificial material, and then in each step. The idea is if a step fails, that material will then be released to the intertidal zone. So this is what construction looked like at Lanes. So you've got pre-construction. These are all from a game camera with these 2 top images that we had in place. This is during construction. There's a tractor working at just above the tide level on rafts. And it's taking these trees and driving them vertically and putting them in horizontally to create the steps. And this is planting those steps at the end. Informational signs were placed at each site. I created these kind of like using PowerPoint and Coastal Program, worked with a supplier to create these beautiful signs. I think they're really nice signs, summarizing kind of what's going on the site. So if people see these, see these installations, they have a little bit more explanation and where they can go to get more information. So how have these fared? This is an aerial image that Rick shot post-construction at Lanes Island. This is the Lanes Island site. You can see it's 50 feet along a huge extent of eroding bluff. But see how well it's tucked into the bluff? It looks really, really pretty tucked onto the face of the bluff. I think this is a promising approach. But as you'll see in my subsequent slides, this might not be the right approach for something so dynamic. So first of all, at Wharton Point. So this construction was finished at the end of May 2020 at Wharton Point. We've seen some minor, this picture is from December, some minor settlement of the georeef here, but in general, that looks great. The shell that we put behind it is still there. A little bit of it has come out. We've had some bags, about 8 shell bags, which have been knocked out since May. They need to be replaced. The bags were restaked and retwined once already, so we have to put some more bags in once we get a good window of weather and then get them back in place. There's been minor sedimentation, and you can see the green algae growing on the bags. And high tide line rack is collecting on the bags when the tide doesn't go up and over. So far it's been somewhat resistant. My corgi here is he was helping me do a site visit and do some maintenance on the site. So pretty easy to maintain if you think about it. At Maquoit Bay Conservation Lands, it's done very, very well. There's only been about 3 bags that have been moved or broken in all the storms that we've had since May of 2020. Some minor twisting and settling of the logs. Bags were staked and restaked once, and I'd say this has been very storm resistant so far. Now, Lane's Island has been a different story. These are images just to give you a sense of what this site looks like from our game camera. This is mounted on a tree and it takes an image about every half hour. I'm going to go through just a couple of images with you to show you how this site has changed over the months up until the end of November. That's the last time I was able to get out there. So this is early September. This is post-construction. By the end of the month, you can see vegetation growing in, dune grass down here, other grasses and shrubs starting to come in up here, some loss of sediment at the toe. That's not unexpected. End of October, somebody stopped on their kayak paddle and had lunch on our installation. It's still looking pretty well. You can see everything has kind of really filled out in here. The beach is a little bit lower. You can see I mean, different tides, but you can see the beach is a little bit higher here than it is in this image. And then let's fast forward to November 16th. We had a super big southeaster event. Remember, this site faces due south. 35 to 45 mile winds, waves, and 2 tidal cycles greater than 12 feet. It eroded all the way back to the second step and is undermining the second step at this point. I don't know what the southeaster that happened at the end of November did, and what about the current nor'easter we're having right now with high water levels. So this site is proving to be very challenging. Just to give you an idea of the changes that are occurring at this site, we did a survey of the highest annual tide line. Basically, it's at the edge of the bluff and at the edge of the coastal dune on this section of Lane's Island in October and then November post-storm. And this is the loss that has occurred: 8 to 12 feet, 6 to 10 feet, 2 to 4 feet, and 4 to 6 feet in the vicinity of the installation. So very, very dynamic. So to kind of summate Lane's Island, we've been unable to visit the site since the mid-November, so we don't know what's happened since then. But these are some images kind of giving you an idea of what's happened to the site. So we've had loss of sediment and plantings in the first step. We've lost our game camera tree. It literally fell down off the bluff. So our change rate is actually exceeding the planned monitoring that we had in place. So moving forward, we have to decide, what do we do here? Do we do nothing? Do we just keep monitoring and see what happens? Do we maintain it to its original design? Do we adapt this design somehow? Or do we remove it? All stuff we'll have to figure out. My final couple slides, some initial lessons learned from these. There were no biodegradable options for something that would survive Maine winters. We may have found that, but we don't know yet because we're just getting into winter with the bags. The things we did with bags and georeefs, volunteer labor could easily be used for that. Something like Lane's Island needs heavy equipment. You don't want volunteers doing something like that. Our project team had to be very adaptable to deal with COVID, to deal with tides, to deal with cleaning shell, and then finding funding for and constructing Lane's Island was a challenge. Messaging is key to avoid project challenges with stakeholders. For instance, if we had slightly different messaging with shell fishermen who were informed of these projects throughout the months that these projects were being developed, maybe we would have been able to quell the dirty oyster shell in the beginning instead of having to adapt on the fly. So when you're building these things and designing them, you need to be adaptable. At Lane's Island, these next 3 points really, I think, go to Lane's Island. We had a lack of historical shoreline change information at Lane's Island. That certainly probably influenced the siting of the treatment. So I think siting of these things is imperative to their success. So my low to low, moderately acceptable ranking in the MGS tool might not necessarily be appropriate for a site like Lane's Island. So we have to use in-depth site-specific information when we make these decisions. We also learned that when you're building a demonstration treatment, make access easy. Don't choose something that's really hard to get to. It just makes things more difficult and more expensive. Our monitoring frequency, especially at something like Lane's Island, was not geared towards something so dynamic. We were going to be visiting it spring, summer, and fall, and maybe once after a storm. It's like we have to be out there almost every 2 weeks based on what's going on. Scale is important. Remember, these are small 50-foot treatments, and they may not be appropriate for determining the efficacy along really long lengths of shoreline. Dynamic sites like Lanes Island might not be the best sites for living shoreline treatments that attempt to stabilize the shoreline. It might make sense to have something that breaks up some wave energy and maintains like a natural beach or a natural coastal wetland. And regular maintenance needs to be expected with these things. So with that, I want to thank all of our partners and special thanks to the organizations that have donated time, money, and effort to this. And that's what I've got for you. Thanks. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Pete. So we have time for 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll have our second presentation. And then after the second presentation, there'll be more time for Q&A. So please raise your hand if you have any questions for Pete.
I think Charlotte's got one.
Yes, go ahead, Charlotte.
Oh, wait.
You're muted, Charlotte.
I couldn't quite tell from the schematic whether those were large root wads, and if they weren't in the first layer, and if they weren't large, why not use larger ones and then backfill behind them with even soil that you could plant something in?
Are you talking about the Lanes Island site?
Yeah.
Sure. They were large. The trees that were used for the installation were at least 10 to 12 inches in diameter. Most of them were bigger. And that actually created another problem, and a lesson learned is you design these things and say 10 to 12 feet, 10 to 12 inches, 10 to 12 feet in length. And then you find out that most of the trees you're dealing with on site are 20 inches or larger in diameter and about 30 feet in length. So, but they were large, and the root balls that were placed into the first step, there were a couple large ones, there were a couple small ones.
What was the diameter? What was the average diameter of the root wads?
I don't remember, but I'd say probably at least 4 feet, 5 feet in diameter of the wads themselves. They removed all the sediment from the wads before they put them in. So they cut them down, then chainsawed the roots down to a certain size that the tractor could move pretty easily.
I just wonder, oh, I see. But I just wonder whether if they were really large, you know, the way root wads are when trees come down, like 10 feet, you know, or 8 feet, whether that would have created a little more stability. I just.
Yeah, it's possible.
Okay. See. Doug McCown.
Yeah, thank you. So you have some takeaways that are, of course, very site specific in a number of ways. But I'm wondering, the town that I'm with has one that, of course, has many different types of eroding sites on it, such as a 50-foot very steep bank where vegetation just can't grow, and there's a tremendous amount of erosion downslope going on. Maybe backyards are disappearing fairly rapidly. So I just give that as an example about, my question is, how much more research do you think will be coming forth about not only improving these particular site efforts, but also attempting new ones that you haven't yet addressed?
That's a good question. I mean, this work was funded through a grant from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And it was limited amounts of funds for this effort. That's why we chose small demonstration treatments. There is certainly interest and desire to do additional demonstration treatments in other locations. The problem is going to be finding funding for that. There's other grant opportunities that are out there that potentially could be used. And I'm sure Martha's going to talk a little bit about some funding opportunities. But I would love to see some demonstration treatments go in other coastal bluff areas. And, you know, a lot of this relates to things also that Damon and Chris will be talking about, which is it's not always just the erosion at the toe of a bluff, for instance, that's causing the problem. It's upland water management, it's groundwater management, and things like that. So a lot of these different factors have to be taken into account in doing this kind of work. But I would love to see more projects going in. We have some additional work that's being done with some other consultants who are very interested in living shoreline approaches that are in Harpswell. They've done a project and they're currently looking to do one up in Blue Hill that beneficially reuses trees, rocks that are brought in to help break up ice, put in strategic locations. And also kind of this coir fiber stuff with plantings. So I think there are a lot of techniques that are being developed, but certainly would love to see more demonstration treatments.
Thank you.
That's a great segue for our next presentation. So Chris Baldwin and I will be presenting about some work we have done working with Basins Island Village Corporation to study some of those effects of upland runoff on a coastal stability. Can everyone see my screen? Just give it a thumbs up. Great. So yeah, as Pete mentioned, upland runoff can have profound effects on shoreline erosion. Now we want some upland runoff to help replenish the tow and the mud flats we all enjoy, but we don't want essentially a fire hose of water coming off of developed sites and then eroding our bluffs at a very rapid rate, which is the case in a lot of locations around Casco Bay. So to tell you a little bit about the case study area. So it's Basins Island. It's off the coast of Freeport. It's an on-bridged island, a seasonal community. It's been in existence for a long time, and many historic homes. It's been developed for a long time. So the development on the island has affected the topography. So it's shifted some of the runoff patterns from natural drainages to other locations, and that's had some effects on erosion rates on the coastal bluffs. So we've been involved with some efforts with the islanders to assess and reduce bluff erosion since around 2016. And the techniques we've tried to look at with the islanders have mostly involved green infrastructure techniques for, let's see. So the next slide should be loading now. I'm not sure if that's, there we go. Okay, sorry. So so the previous work we've done, there was a grant from 2015 to 2017, a NOAA-funded grant collaboration with the state and Maine Geological Survey. With that, we produced an assessment tool to help assess the rates of erosion on coastal bluffs, and also a decision-making framework to help determine, given the rate of erosion and the various factors on the site, what might be done to address that, if anything should be done, which isn't always the case that something should be done. And also we produced a coastal planting guide in collaboration with the state and other partners that includes information where using site parameters, things like direction, salt spray, slope, things like that, you can determine ideal plantings of native and non-invasive plants for a site. So we've built on that work since 2017, and the islanders have a significant amount of resources and capacity, fortunately, and they've been working to assess and experiment in the meantime with natural basin and drainage improvements. And that led to a grant award in 2019, a coastal community grant. And the goal of this is to focus on managing upland runoff using the low-cost, locally available methods we've mentioned, that's decentralized and incorporates low-impact development green infrastructure techniques. Charlotte Kahn with Basins Island Village Corporation played a huge role in that, and she's really done an excellent job of spearheading these efforts, along with other people on the island, who Chris will discuss a little bit more. And the really accomplishes a variety of goals, including aquifer recharge, reducing road erosion, restoring natural habitats, in addition to protecting coastal bluffs. So it's a holistic approach. So just to give you some background on where we're looking at here, we're not looking at the entire island. We're looking at a project area for this case study on the southeast side of the island, where Maine Geological Survey has flagged there being accelerated bluff erosion rates. So you can see a picture of that here with the indication of the arrow there about where that is on the island. Some observations that the islanders have made is that these coastal bluffs are, that the confirmed MGS's observations are the coastal bluffs are eroding, many of them from the top. Pooled water is observed, so there's lack of infiltration, things like cloudy polluted seawater. So indications of accelerated erosion have been noted. So the approach, the overarching goal is to, within the case study area, is to hold and slow the stormwater runoff in these the southeast subbasins of the island. For part of our analysis, we divided the island up into various subbasins using a computer model. So that's what these yellow lines indicate. And just some basic background about the water cycle and some of the terms we're using here. And our focus is really on runoff here. So as precipitation comes down, it hits the land and then it goes downhill. Some of it will infiltrate and some of it will sheet right off into the surface waters at a high rate of speed. And that's especially true along hardened surfaces like roads, roofs, and other types of developments. So considering that, our solutions and here are to work with natural systems and materials. And again, the real goals are recharging the aquifer, protecting the bluffs, reducing the road erosion, and restoring habitats. So here we have Chris Baldwin in the field using COVID safety procedures, doing an assessment of a roadside basin that the islanders have been experimenting with. So some of the potential for solutions here, you can see on this map, it shows the sub-basins. We've generated their computer model. And our real focus here is this road here that runs down here, this direction toward, this is the village library, post office. So there's a playground here. So it's a pretty important public area. So we're really looking at some of the solutions in this general area. And for some more details about that, I'm going to turn it over to District Engineer Chris Baldwin, and take it away, Chris.
Thank you, Damon. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay.
Yep.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I am Chris Baldwin, the District Engineer at the Solon Water Conservation District. And I have to say, it's been a pleasure to work on this project. Pretty exciting work out there, and it's just been a joy working with Charlotte, who has really spearheaded this whole thing. And hats off to you, Charlotte, for all your help here.
No, wait, and our landscape committee, and especially Jim Boyko, who's done a huge amount of the really hard work.
I'll get to them, Charlotte. I'll get to them. But again, thank you. Just working on an island during pandemic is such a challenge. Very difficult in a lot of aspects. A lot of the things that we were trying to do out there were they're community-driven efforts. They're efforts you want to work with the landowners on. You want to use local materials and labor, low-cost solutions, but you really want to work with the islanders and the landowners. And unfortunately, this pandemic just made that so difficult this summer to do. So we were able to prepare some concept designs and construct some pilot projects. And I'll discuss those today. But I did also want to give special thanks to Jim Boyko, Crawford Teasley, two gentlemen from the island that were just instrumental in making some of these pilot projects happen. So next. So again, we're talking about green infrastructure here. Basically, we're trying to mimic the natural systems that exist out in the environment. And specifically for Buston Islands, we're trying to follow these 4 R's, which are to recharge the aquifer. Groundwater is so important on an island like this. Everybody has wells. In fact, just about every house has a cistern to collect water off the roof. That's how important it is to control and maintain your water. Also, reducing road erosion. Maintenance of roads is expensive. It's not something that these folks have a lot of money to do. It also results in sedimentation and of course the resulting road maintenance. Restoring habitats, both in gardens and different types of natural areas for all kinds of fauna and flora. And then ultimately to redirect the runoff from the coastal bluff, particularly in this southeast subbasin where the accelerated erosion has been found. So we're looking at methods to do that. Next. So we chose 3 areas to study, and we chose these areas because they all end up distributing runoff down to that that subbasin and that southern subbasin and the bluff down there. So we're looking at the 3 areas here that seem to put off the most water, and we're looking to slow it or capture that storm water before it has a chance to concentrate and get all the way down there. We did choose these sites also because they're public land, or else they were willing landowners right from the beginning that wanted to work on this project with us. Next. So area 1 is the main road, gravel road, that this rather steep hill that comes down all the way down to the bottom of the hill where there's a playground that's almost always saturated. The public buildings, the post office, the museum, library are down that way. And then all that runoff continues on down to the bluff. So we chose next to divert the water off of this road, and we use very simple diverters to do this. Simple berms across the road to cut off that concentrated flow and direct it into settling basins. We have to note here that we are on an island with very minimal vehicle traffic, and nobody's out there in the winter, so there's no plowing. So this type of best management practice actually has a life out there several years, rather than if you're trying to do it someplace where a plow truck or where there's a lot of vehicle traffic. Next. So the idea would be that the water would hit that diverter berm and then run off into one of these this is our first pilot project, one of these settling basins. And the settling basin viewed here was right after a storm event, so you can see how well it collected that runoff off the road. It's rather cloudy, so there's some sedimentation taking place there, and a lot of that water will infiltrate in. As you can see here, the water actually exits that basin when it becomes too full into a riprap channel that's used to convey that water down the slope. Next. With the concept plan being a series of these diverters and settling basins along the edge of the road, so that you're continually pulling off that water in smaller and smaller increments, more manageable quantities, and controlling it as you move it down the road, thereby experiencing less road erosion. And I will note that there's been some concern about the drainage ditch, and the fact that as an engineer, the first thing I want to do is riprap it. But there's some concerns about hazards and a lot of rock around there. So we're looking at other options like turf reinforced mats and things like that, because we do want to build something that's going to, that the islanders are going to be happy with, and that they feel like it's going to, fits their island. Next. So part of that pilot project, again, was all the way down at the bottom of these cascading settling basins. Doing just some very minor berm work, we were able to create some detention or settling basins down in the forest area where this water really has an opportunity to kind of settle, lose its energy. We can manage it a little better, and ultimately, during really large events, we can direct it away from that southeast slope that's having the accelerated erosion on it. Again, these were built on both private and public lands. And again, this is the outlet for those cascading sediment basins that come down the main road. Area 2. Oh, excuse me, next. Second area would be up above the main road. Here, we're just trying to show how with a very simple turnout on a small section of road, we can remove that runoff from the rest of the runoff that ultimately ends up down on that road and further downstream, and just turn it off into some type of roadside feature. In this instance, we're talking about just regenerating the ferns that are there and creating a fern garden, so to speak, to kind of absorb this water, control it again before we turn it back out to the road during large events. We do have to note that, you know, almost every single one of these properties has its own well and its own septic system. A lot of that's been mapped for us, and we've included it into all of our GIS and map systems. But we're always mapping where those things are. You can see where this property has a septic and a well, and we'll be making sure to turn all water away from those systems. Next. And the final area we were looking at is all the way down at the base of the hill. So we're hoping at this point that we've controlled and managed most of the water that's been running down here historically, where we've had a lot of wet area. The playgrounds over there around the buildings has typically been fairly saturated. So now what we still have is some water coming down the hillside, which would be the left of the buildings in the photo. And the roof runoff itself from these buildings that have no gutters or anything to control it. Next. So as a past pilot project, as part of some past work, folks of the island built a rain garden right at the base of this hill to intercept that flow. Does a great job coming down there. The plants are all uptaking that water, and we've got some lovely plants in there to attract butterflies and different things like that. Meanwhile, the soils and the plants all filter out any pollutant or sediment that might be there, and we get clean water soaking into the ground. And what the plan is, the concept plan here is to build another one of those just a little bit to the left and upstream that will then tie into that. So we start catching more and more areas of the hillside. And then finally, around the buildings, we're proposing to put in a low maintenance gutter. Low maintenance in the fact that there's not enough time out there to deal with cleaning leaves out of a gutter. So in this instance, we find a gutter with a storage lid on it that will prevent the leaves to get on it, but the water all still collects. The downspouts from the gutter will run into some type of infiltration well or drip lines for a well. We still have to do a little bit of test pitting out there. There's still some work to do this spring to locate a good source or a good location to infiltrate that water. But that's just one of the next steps that we hope to kind of take care of in early 2021 when we can get out there again. So those are the three areas we kind of looked at. I'll turn it back over to Damon to talk about some of our next steps. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. So our next steps here to continue to do site assessments, work with the island community and the landowners to determine what should these projects they'd like to move forward with, and sort of make adjustments as needed, do some additional study and develop additional designs. The hope is that we'll be out there in the spring and maybe starting to build some of these things, and then assess how they perform and make adjustments as we go. And a really good resource for this island in particular is there's a really interested community of gardeners and who will be able to propagate native plants and make some selections from the Coastal Planting Guide and other resources. And you know, as we're all thinking about, hopefully this has inspired many of you to think about your sites and your communities and local resources and groups. And I encourage you to think broadly and include, say, local garden clubs and others who may help contribute to some of this green infrastructure work. So with that, we'll take some quick questions before we go to Martha with some information on financial resources. I will stop sharing my screen. Harold, do you want to call on people? I think you can see the participants lists better than I can.
I see Doug has a question.
Hi, thank you. How confident are you that the gutter system and your retention ponds will hold the type of water runoff that would have happened if instead having snow over the last, I don't know, 18 hours that we've had it, it would have been rain instead?
Yeah, I'll handle that as best I can. You're right. I'm looking out here in Brunswick and it's a foot of snow. We all know that means several inches of rain probably fell over the last few inches, the last few hours. We size these things as large as we can. Typically, we're controlled. We have constraints as far as available land and that type of thing to actually run these basins into. I will be looking at sizing them through a HydroCAD analysis to see exactly what we can do. But most important is we always treat the outlet. We always stabilize the outlet and provide an outlet to flow in a direction where it won't cause any flooding or cause any additional bluff erosion. So that's about the best we can do is, for the really large storms that we're just not able to retrofit for, to make sure that, the outflow is at least safe.
Thank you.
Say, Chris, can I add something to that? Did you hear me?
Jim Boyko, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, hi, okay. I don't have a camera, but the photographs that we saw in the wooded area. Before we started working on that flow just went like a river down to right over the shore. So, we saw those natural basins in there and took advantage of them. And really it was just, simple shovel and pick work. So, if it's a whole lot better than what it was, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. And I think we have to, we're all interested in knowing how that would perform under a 30 or 50-year storm, that kind of scenario. But with a little bit of work, we made it a whole lot better. So and the other point I think is that I think already these little projects that we've done are sort of informal teaching moments for other people on the island. They see them, over time they understand them, and they know that they can pick up a shovel and pick and probably do something on their land, or it teaches a principle. So I think I kind of answered that question. It's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than the way it was. So
Thanks so much.
I think Kathleen has a question or comment.
Yeah, hi, thanks everybody. Kathleen Layden. I work at Department of Marine Resources, Coastal Program. Just a comment that it's really nice to see, hey Chris, long time. Been really nice to see some of how the continuation of some projects that were NOAA funded to the Coastal Program, and then the grant to Basins, and as well as the Living Shoreline pilot. It's so great to see that we're advancing this. And I'm jealous of the Basins case study. What a wonderful project, but the jealousy is that you worked on a system in a public-private partnership where you could address your issues comprehensively. And on many islands, I think, especially, developed ones, there are stormwater issues that need to be addressed first. And sometimes that step gets left out. So it's a great example of that. But I just want to say a little bit about where we hope to go. Pete mentioned the lessons learned was great. And I think we'll definitely be documenting those and distributing those to a wider audience because of the number of people of a variety of types that are interested in these treatments. But we're seeing, there's a lot of interest in armoring of the coast in areas of episodic and continuous erosion in these types of locations, the bluff locations. And the governor's climate plan, the Maine Climate Council's plan, does call for it, calls attention and specifies a number of strategies around nature-based solutions. How we get there in terms of incentivizing them for landowners, you know, Pete, one of his comments was the length of the treatment. It's a very different project. So for lanes, there was no comprehensive evaluation of things that could be done at different places. It was a research project essentially, as opposed to a project that would, you know, have a comprehensive or series of different types of solutions. So, you know, cost benefit, it's more like in some locations, it's a garden that requires maintenance on the part of the landowner. So that's where we're headed, is to try to get more of these types of things on the ground, to learn from them, and then to really get it to the point where more people are willing to enter into partnerships with conservation organizations to install more of these things. So thank you. That was long-winded, but thank you for your work.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I think that's a perfect segue for us to turn it over to Martha to talk about some of the options to finance some of this work. And I do want to say I really appreciate working with the Basins Island community. Wonderful community people and a beautiful island, and always happy to go out there and do some field work. And go ahead, Martha.
Thanks, Damon. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Good. Okay, great. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to give a very brief primer on how to approach looking for funds for living shorelines and in general nature-based solutions work. With the agenda that you got today, you also got a funding matrix that I developed that is particularly geared to nature-based solutions kinds of projects. And any questions about that, you can always call me. It doesn't include every funding source for every kind of project. Like I said, I made it more specific to nature-based solutions projects. So let me share my screen. I have a pretty boring slideshow, not as dynamic as the others. But so let me get that up here. Can everybody see that? Good? Okay, perfect. Okay, great. So you probably attended this webinar because more than likely you have a problem in your community that needs to be fixed, such as coastal erosion, inundation of your shoreline, flooding, or some other vulnerability, or maybe some properties along your shoreline are in a dangerous spot that you're worried about, or maybe there's wildlife habitat that is going to be compromised with more inundation, like for piping plovers, or you might have a combination of some of these problems. You might even have bigger problems, such as maybe having drinking water pipes that are buried and are getting eroded and are very vulnerable, or sewer lines. So whatever your problem is, I think that what I'm going to try to do is tell you about an approach that you should take for financing projects that include nature-based solutions. So fixing vulnerability problems is a big bang for your buck, because you can realize so many other benefits and co-benefits from doing just one project. Some of those benefits include the triple bottom line kind of benefits. For example, social benefits might include providing education to the volunteers that are going to work on your project, just like at Basins Island. And you involve the local community. You also increase recreation opportunities. Some environmental benefits might be water quality or water quantity benefits. Some economic benefits might include avoided costs from property damages. So with nature-based solutions, you have so many benefits that you can get from just implementing one project that you can draw in many partners. Of course, it requires what Kathleen was getting at is it includes you need to have an integrated approach that works across agencies in your city or your town. And you could build in nature-based solutions to community, your traditional community planning processes. There's a really great document that I think was sent around, but I'm not sure. If not, we will send it around when you do the survey. It's the source is cited down here. It's called Building Community Resilience with Nature-Based Solutions. It's a guide for local communities. It's from FEMA, and I would advise anybody who's interested in nature-based solution funding to please access that document and read that. What I'm presenting here is taken a lot from that document. It's like a go-to document for financing. And like I was saying earlier, a single project may be eligible for a variety of public, private, and state funding opportunities. Hold on a sec. An important thing is to get your community behind any project that you attempt with nature-based solutions. The more support you have from the various departments in your city or your town, the better your chances of driving the financing solution. You should think outside the box. Don't just focus on how am I going to pay for this living shore project, but think about all the different social, economic, and environmental benefits that you will obtain once the project is done, and apply for funding from agencies that support those goals. Oh boy. Good time to get a call from my son. Okay, sorry about that distraction. I want to give you an example of how to access different sources of funds for just one project. If you have a coastal, if your coastal community wants to reduce flooding by using nature-based approaches, you can apply for various sources of funds. For example, you can apply to FEMA for a hazard mitigation grant. You can get a habitat conservation grant. You can get a water quality grant. You can get a coastal resilience grant from the state. You can access community development block grants to augment any other grants that you have. And you could also think about solving some of the stormwater issues that was mentioned for the Bustins Island project by, if you're a larger community, with things like such as like a stormwater utility. So what I'm trying to get at is that you should think about expansive solutions, even if you only have one project to do, because of the nature of nature-based solutions is that there are so many co-benefits that you can stitch together sources of many funds in order to augment that one project that you need to get done. And another thing that I'd like to impress upon you is that, how do you get help? You can always call me. I'm a technical assistance provider that can help you with stitching together financing for your particular project. But you can also call another technical assistance provider in the state that you feel more comfortable with, like your council of government, Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, your soil and water conservation district, land trust that you work with, or any other nonprofit organization like TNC, CCAP members, GMRI, or the state funders. Everybody is there to try to help you figure out how to stitch together financing for your particular project. So I didn't have a lot of time. I covered a lot of material, but I think I've run out of time. So I will stop sharing my screen. And if there are any questions, please let me know. I can't see everyone at once, so I don't see any questions. Does anybody see questions? Okay, great. I'm going to turn it over to Victoria.
Okay, thank you to all the presenters. There's a lot of information, a lot of really good content. Normally in these workshops, we, when we're in person, we have pizza and we sit around a table and chat in small groups. In COVID time, a lot of you probably have been part of these workshops where we do small breakout rooms on Zoom. But given the time and wanting to get everyone out of here on time so you can shovel, etc. Let's just have a conversation as a full group. Harold, Damon, Martha, if you could help me with hand raises. But what we were going to do in small groups is essentially find out what's going on in your communities in this area. We've thrown out a lot of terms: green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, what this can look like in your town. Perhaps you're working with the land trust on land conservation projects. Maybe your garden club is putting in rain gardens. Maybe you're working on tree canopy with the state canopy program. So there's a lot of different forms that green infrastructure can take. So what I thought we would do, instead of taking the time to go into small groups, is ask if anyone would like to share any projects that are going on in your community. And if so, what have some of the challenges been? What have the successes been? Any words of wisdom? And then if anyone has any lingering questions for the presenters, we can use that time for that as well. And just leave about 5 minutes at the end to wrap up. So any projects that anyone wants to talk about?
I've got one potentially. This is Fred Dillon with the City of South Portland.
Hi, Fred. Yeah, please.
Yeah, and maybe some of you have probably heard of this project and maybe seen it in the local news. And it's kind of a little bit of a gimmicky thing, but it's done in all seriousness. But the city has a land care management ordinance now, and one of the chapters in that ordinance is for pesticide use. And we have a small underutilized park that's on our green belt that fronts right on the Fore River that has been overrun with Japanese knotweed. And it's about a 1/4 acre parcel, and it's literally right on the green belt, so it's got a high visibility. And a couple of years ago, just to kind of kickstart this process, and we got funding through the Community Development Block Grant Program through the city's CDBG fund. And we still have quite a bit of money left in that pot and have to finish the project up. But we brought goats in, so I'm not exactly sure how they fit within the realm of green infrastructure, but they were kind of a first step, and they were super popular. And they got, we literally got, I think we might have even gotten international exposure. I mean, it got a lot of local media coverage, and I think it even got some national. And then maybe, I don't know if South Korean news picked it up or some crazy thing like that. But the goats actually really did a good job, and the basis behind that was the pesticide ordinance prohibits the use of synthetics, and the goats came in and literally ate the knotweed down to the soil. And so the second step of that was to build on some work that our Conservation Commission had done. A fellow named Dan Hogan near our Hannaford, near Mill Cove, and it's called the Pope Preserve. And he used carpeting. He was a property manager, would get carpeting from some of the places that he was working in, and he laid it down on Japanese knotweed and put mulch on top of that. So we've used a different ground covering, but we're using that now to cover up smother the knotweed. And I don't know if we'll actually eradicate it, but we're hoping that we can control it. And it's literally, it's 50 feet from the kind of tidal water. So now we've got this pilot project, with some interpretive signage there that we're going to run for a few years and try and encourage folks to maybe use it as a demonstration of what they can do on their own property. So stay tuned for more on that.
That's a great example, Fred. I'm glad you brought that up. It's a very creative solution to the problem. I don't know if you need to continue to use goats and bring them in every year, but maybe you can send us more information about that. Anyone else, other ideas of projects that you're working on in your community? Or questions for the presenters? Does anyone see any hands raised?
I don't see any.
Oh, Doug McCown.
Yeah, I was a little reluctant to raise my hand once again, but thank you. So 2 projects where I am, one is on one end of the island, the other on the other end. They're totally different. Both are due to erosion. One is lowland down by the sea. People have lost maybe 50 feet of their property already, and they've piled in logs and rocks and filled lobster pots with rocks and put them up there too. And it seems to be temporarily working, but it's probably quite temporary. So, but nobody has a greater solution. It's ugly and it needs to be maintained. And in the winter, some of these are dislodged and have to be redone. And some of it is heavy work for volunteers. The other end of the island is a slope that's probably 40 feet high. That is so steep that nothing can grow on it. And it just cascading down onto the beach. And people, of course, are losing their property there as well. And nobody knows what to do about that one either at the moment. So it's become a town issue, quite a town issue, because we want it to stop. We want to address it, of course. So no great solutions, lack of them, actually.
Well, you know, we learn from our challenges too, and maybe others have solutions. Doug, I missed which island you were talking about. Sorry?
Long Island.
Long Island, okay. Good to see some islanders on here. Bob Ernest, did I see a hand raise or was?
Yes, I had a question for Doug. That first solution that you described, I almost hate to ask the question in such august company, but did that get permitted or was it just sort of done on the side?
I don't know. I just moved onto the island and just joined the planning board. And so I'm on a steep learning curve. I don't have an answer for you. Sorry.
Thank you.
This is Pete. I will build on what Doug just said. It's interesting. One of our initial concepts was to use derelict lobster traps for some of our demonstration treatments, but it was a little bit frowned upon by the regulatory community. So I don't know whether or not yours was the one you referenced was permitted or not, but that is a novel idea. And I know it's been used elsewhere as well, not lobster traps, but crab traps. They actually take the crab traps, dip them in cement and put them out. But it's in areas where there's very, very high colonization rates by oysters. So oysters are on them within a couple of weeks. And then, you know, in a couple of months, you have a full reef covered with oysters. So.
Doug,
Martha.
it's Martha. I was just going to suggest that if you're interested in trying to figure out solutions, one thing to do is maybe get a planning grant, and I can work with you to figure out what the best option there is and start with a planning grant. There'll have to be some studies done, and then we can build on what we discover in terms of what we target for financing and funding. So if you're interested, give us a call.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Charlotte, and then Fred.
I'm just wondering about the relationship between people working on these experimental projects and the people working on regulations, because it does seem as if sometimes the regulations undermine our efforts at using natural materials and doing these experiments. For example, you know, it's pretty clear that resilient, lower growing plants with really dense root systems like sumac and bayberry are really good on slopes and help hold the slopes. But if you've got trees growing up at the same time, you know, quickly, they start to shade out those lower growing dense plants, and actually you can see the erosion starting around the roots of the trees. So I just wonder, you know, but we're not supposed to cut the trees. So I wonder whether somebody is looking into that, so that because erosion really is a problem, especially, well, in our case, erosion from the top. You know, we've lost whole pieces of the shoreline And I suspect that some of the other erosion that we've seen in some of the other pictures are also the result of upland erosion kind of meeting sea level rise. So that it's an issue, but if we don't have regulators on our side, then it's harder to come up with sustainable solutions. I wonder if anybody's working on that.
I think either Pete or perhaps if Kathleen is still on the line, not to put you on the spot, but if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll certainly say I agree. There's, there are a tree on the top of a slope, especially a large one, if it's an unstable slope. If that tree goes, it's going to bring down tons of sediment with it, and take out a huge section of bluff. Yet at the same time, as you note, a lot of shoreline zoning regulations, if you cut down a tree, you need to replant it elsewhere. So I think what we need to be doing is thinking about, if a tree does need to be cut down like that, and there's a big benefit to it, for instance, but you don't need to remove the whole tree from the slope. You cut it and leave its root mass, and then all the weight is then gone.
Right.
Everything stays in place. So I think and then we've had some initial discussions about that, and what actually, I think Long Island is working on this too. Doug, you probably know some folks that have been looking at this, but the definition of what a hazard tree is varies from town to town. And sometimes a hazard tree is if there's nothing that the tree is threatening. In other words, if it's not threatening a house, then it's not considered a hazard tree. Now, converse to that is maybe some of the regulations need to be looked at in terms of if that tree goes down and brings down half the slope with it, and it's 10, 20 feet from a house, what is the actual, is it then a hazard tree? So there's a lot of things I think that need to go into that. But there have been, from a regulatory standpoint, we did work with the Army Corps of Engineers to actually incorporate living shoreline techniques into their most recent Maine general permit. So some revisions to the general permit occurred where language actually went in there in terms of sequentialization of projects. You look at doing nothing, soft approaches, living shorelines, bulkheads. And living shorelines are not going to be appropriate in every situation. I think that's a very important point that people need to know. You're not going to take a living, as we're finding out on Lane's Island, for instance, it might not work there, or it needs to be much bigger to actually be effective. But some dynamic areas with big waves and stuff where you have erosion problems, a living shoreline is probably not going to work there. You have big waves attacking on top of a ledge. It's just not going to work. And there's probably no living shorelines there anyway, in terms of wetlands or something that buffers the coastline. So in those areas, you are going to be moving to more traditional engineering structures.
Right, but my point is, if you have upland erosion working against you, you're going to lose that slope from the top. I think you really can repair that, before it happens.
I think it's something that definitely needs to be looked at, especially from that shoreline zoning standpoint as it relates to bluff stability in terms of tree management. I'm not a regulator, so I'm not going to go much further than that. But I think it is certainly something that we're seeing more of in terms of management of unstable slopes by managing the vegetation on the slope is a big first step. Managing the groundwater and the vegetation are two big things, especially when you're having issues from the top.
Okay, thank you. Maybe, I know Fred, Teo, or Fred, do you have a question, and then Teo, and then I'll wrap things up.
I was just going to make a quick, actually closely related to what Charlotte was saying, and from the regulatory perspective is the permitting perspective, right? So even though the project that I mentioned in South Portland isn't strictly speaking a living shoreline, it's kind of a cautionary tale in that I was checking all the boxes. I get the DEP PBR permit, I get a historic preservation, check with them. So they're confirmed it was an archaeological site, Army Corps. And then the last thing that I didn't do was check with our local ordinance, which had a prohibition on bringing animals in for grazing. So we actually literally had to create an animal grazing ordinance after the fact. So yeah, I mean, check on your regulatory your permitting requirements early and often, right? So I mean, that's really important. So so yeah, so South Portland's a little bit of a cautionary tale because I forgot to check with my own regulations. So.
Thanks, Fred. Animal grazing, check, noted. All right, Teo, you close out the questions.
Great. Thank you so much for this program. I think it really shows to all of us the challenges involved with creating living shoreline projects. I wanted to add one other element to it. I work for the town of Falmouth, but actually I live in Georgetown, and I live right on the Sasanoa River, and we have an eroded bank. Wanted to do the right thing. What people typically do is just pile a whole bunch of rock along the shore. You've probably all seen it everywhere. And we wanted to do something different. So we did get a proposal from a company to do a living shoreline project, which was a cobble reinforced marsh and a sloped planted envelope of soil with coconut fiberol. And I won't go into the very technical details of it, but there were two issues with it. One was cost for a private homeowner. The cost for 70 to 80 feet of this installation would be estimated at $50,000. And the other aspect of it was it did not come with any guarantee. You know, if you buy a tree and you have it planted, you typically get a 1-year guarantee if the tree dies, but it did not come with any guarantee. But it did come with a requirement to water the plants that are on the slope that typically get submerged at the higher tide level. So I think what I'm trying to say is that it poses significant challenges for homeowners financially as well as operationally. So we had to decline pursuing that particular project, but knowing that most of Maine's coastline is not publicly owned, but it's privately owned, I think it really shows the challenge that we have. So I looked at the funding sheet that was attached to the program, and it looked like everything was really geared towards publicly owned sites. And that for homeowners such as myself, who is faced with I want to do the right thing project, but I don't have $50,000 to put towards it, it kind of creates a problem, if you will. And seeing that with all the effort and expertise that the projects that have been piloted have challenges too, yeah, that makes you really scratch your head, if you will. Anyway, so I just wanted to add that sort of the private homeowner side dilemma to the discussion.
Thank you for adding that note of realism to our discussion. And certainly we're all in agreement that this is still very much in the pilot stage. Projects like this have been happening in other parts of the country, but it's, you know, it's fairly new up here in this region. So we'll continue to pilot and improve as we go along. So I wanted to thank all of our presenters, Pete Slovinsky, Damon, Chris Baldwin, and Martha. Thank you to everyone who participated on this snowy day. I'm going to be sending out a brief evaluation. I would really appreciate if you could take a few minutes to fill that out and help us improve our programs. This is a quarterly series. And if you'd like to be alerted to our next program, there will be a spot on the evaluation form to fill that out. I'll also amend the evaluation to provide a comment field if anyone didn't get a chance to talk about projects in their community on this topic. That will be a good place to do it. And we have additional documents to send out as well. So thank you all again, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. And thanks to GPI.
Thank you.
Enjoy the snow.
Thanks, everyone.